It is a Monday morning. It's not particularly summery, but it's all right. Peter Hitchens is here. Very good morning to you.
Good morning.
Nice to see you. It was very summery at the weekend. I thought summer had arrived. And
Summer sometimes comes later in the day, it seems to come.
Yes, it does, but it's a bit chilly this morning.
Yeah, well, I like that. I don't like it too hot.
No, I know. Well, that is... So we're supposed to have the hottest day of the year, apparently, on Wednesday.
Oh.
I'll believe it when I see it.
I'll take cover.
Just before we get going onto the subject of crime and punishment and all the rest of it, what did you make of that Rishi Sunak statement?
Well, it's obviously about the election, isn't it? They have to demonstrate, this government, that they are doing something about the migration crisis.
Yeah, talking about it.
They will simply, they simply haven't got a chance. If they can do something convincing and effective about it, then I think they would regain a lot of votes. So you can see how much they're investing in it. One has to ask, after so many Tory leaders have said that they will do these things, whether they will succeed, or indeed who could succeed under the circumstances within the political possibilities that we have. But I think that's really basically all about politics.
I don't think they know what to do. I think they've been taken aback and sort of taken by surprise by the speed and the numbers of this business now, because that's what it is.
Yes, but they do realise that if they don't do something, then they're done for. So I think they might actually finally find something that actually does bring the numbers down. Yeah. But they're not going to make any notice the total absence of predictions of numbers or targets, because they're afraid of not meeting them.
Yeah, because they can't, it would seem. Let's talk about what you wrote about this weekend, which was fascinating. You put a particular phrase into Google, and the amount of things that came back was staggering. Yes,
it goes his head, and then they kicked his head like a football.
Right.
And this happens so much. I mean, it was the Gary Newlove case, which you probably remember, of the man who went out to remonstrate with youths on the street who were, I think, attacking his wife's car. Yeah. And I noticed that in reports of that, and I began to look out for it. There are two things you can look at, you can Google, and if you do it on Google rather than electronic libraries, it brings up all the local newspapers. One is, then they kicked his head like a football. The other is, was spared jail. These are the two things, and they both bring up enormous numbers of results, because
and it was six figures,
huge numbers of people are not going to prison for offences which they once would have done. And judges are not, and that's how the headline goes. And then there's this awful business of people being so cruel that when they attack someone, they continue to attack them, and they kick them in the head, which is a really
while they're lying on the ground,
filthy, horrible thing to do. And yet it's become common. Yeah. And the reason I picked on the particular case in a village in Alverstoke,
where you grew up,
where I grew up, and I remember I was actually living in Moscow when I picked this up. I was surfing through the English wire services, and it came up, and I thought, good heavens, if this is happening in Alverstoke, then nowhere is safe. And I'd been out of the country for a bit by then. When I finally got back, I realised something very significant had happened. And I think for a lot of people there is this danger. If you see trouble in your street, the only sensible thing to do is to turn your back on it and ignore it, because if you do what Gary Newlove did and go out, then there's a terrible danger of it turning very nasty indeed. In the Alverstoke case, a man was killed, and that was back in 92, and I don't think it gets any better. Contrast that, by the way, fascinating story in some of the papers this morning about the town of Maryport in Cumbria, where the police have actually had the brilliant idea of putting a police officer on patrol.
How revolutionary.
And it's extraordinary, isn't it? How did they think of it? Yeah. And as a result, antisocial behaviour has dropped by about half.
Really?
One copper.
One police officer.
One copper patrolling.
I mean, the thing about police
that's
now,
all it needs.
You see them. I mean, I came past a station, an overground station near me, and there were two police officers standing outside it, and there was some tape going from one tree to another tree, and then something sort of partially blocking the entrance. No idea what it was about, no idea what they were doing there. I don't know if they were looking for people to talk to about an incident. There was no sign. I'm not just, but it's the first time I've seen two police officers together in my neighbourhood for about 3 years.
Two together is not what you want. If you have two police together, they'll be chatting to each other about overtime. I've seen it in the centre of a city well known to me, where there's a street where you're not supposed to ride your bicycle, and the police are standing there.
Of course.
And the two of them chatting to each other and whizzing by in all directions around them, and people illegally riding bicycles. They don't notice, because the single police officer is another matter. This is one of the things why I go on about. Individual police officers on proper patrol would transform the country, pretty much overnight. And here this evidence from Maryport seems to me to back up completely what I'm saying. And it's the exact opposite of this thing which has happened in the suburbs, where in so many cases the worst kind of people behaving very badly have got used to the fact that everybody's afraid of them and nothing will happen if they misbehave.
Yeah, and if they are misbehaving in this way, do you think that's something that is a result of there not being police, or has human behaviour changed more?
I think, well, of course, behaviour changes as
are people more violent?
It's like when the Roman Empire retreated from its outward areas. As soon as the troops went, people, the danger grows, but not immediately. It doesn't happen overnight. Right. Bit by bit, people realise there's nobody there anymore. The presence of a uniformed police officer simply walking has a huge effect. Judge it for yourself. If ever you see a police officer or a police car when you're driving or anything, your behaviour changes, and this affects everybody, and they just won't do it. My proposal is that the police, as they're laughingly called, if they were all abducted by aliens tonight, how long would it take most of us to notice? These police forces, as they are, have failed. We should train new police forces to replace them and disband them, because they are a useless nationalised industry which doesn't work and long ago ceased to serve the public. This Maryport episode establishes, I think, beyond doubt that if we went back to the basic job, the 19th century job, never ever disproved or undermined by practical experience, that police officers patrol to deter crime, then you would have a
also
much safer
to make
country.
it safe for ordinary people to be able to walk around their neighbourhood. And as you said at the weekend, there's an awful lot of people, I think, who don't feel safe in their own neighbourhood, so they don't go out. Well, so then it's the old broken window sort of philosophy, isn't it?
There's this stuff about reaction times. The police, what is more useless than a police officer after a crime? Unless he or she can do first aid, they cannot unburgle you, they cannot unkick your head. They cannot undo the thing which happened. Whereas if they had been there in the first place, their mere presence would have changed the behaviour, not merely of the bad people, but the behaviour of the good people who are given confidence by the presence of the uniformed police on the streets. This is how it works in New York City, or worked when they had their long period, the Bratton period, when they actually took seriously the business of keeping the streets safe. Because people became confident. People who hadn't dared go out at night or in various areas started going out again. The streets were full of law-abiding people who expected it to be peaceful, and the bad element retreats when that happens. It's very, very simple, and it's astonishing how neither government nor police will pay any attention to it at all.
No, that is the problem, because we see on a daily basis now, because of Just Stop Oil's continued sort of, ad infinitum demonstration, which they say is going to go on indefinitely, as long as they've got the money to do it. Despite the fact that people are now getting more and more enraged and are responding, I've been calling them the resistance. The ordinary sort of working people of London are now the resistance. But there are breaches of the peace being created.
You have to get on top of this,
and somebody will get badly hurt.
This has a reason behind it. This is a judgment by the so-called Supreme Court set up by the Blairites. I have very little sympathy, as I just demonstrated, for the police, but in this case, the law now says, thanks to this so-called Supreme Court legislating on its own part, the law now says that if you can come up with a political justification, the old laws that it was an absolute offence to obstruct the highway have been wiped out. The police cannot act as we would wish them to, and people have to get on top of this. That Supreme Court is a disaster and has to go. And it's astonishing to me. I looked into it in some depth. It's astonishing to me how little discussion there is about this element. But yeah, sure, there's no doubt that there is a growing discontent about this. What's very interesting, though, is that in a lot of other countries, notably Germany and the Netherlands now, there is a growing public discontent at the impositions on everybody of the Green Movement. Farmers in the Netherlands being put out of business, people in Germany being forced to install heat pumps. Ultimately, people are beginning to realise, far too late, what the green zealotry means in terms of lower standards of living, a more inefficient society,
higher energy costs,
and indeed, in the case of the Netherlands, the destruction of one of the most efficient agricultures in the world. It's astonishing what's going on.
Well, you see, they're
there.
doing it in Ireland now. They're going to kill 200,000 cattle with a view to saving the climate.
Well, I think again,
which is extraordinary.
With a bit of luck, this will generate democratic and peaceful political opposition on such a scale that people will begin to question the green orthodoxy, which has... Remember, when this stuff was being put through Parliament, I think only about 3 MPs spoke or voted against it. Totally unanimous.
Yeah.
And it's quite dangerous to speak out against it.
Oh,
but I think it is now becoming...
we get MPs on here, as you can imagine, all the time, and if try and get one of them to say they're against net zero, you can't. No. None of them are.
No, and of course the King is in favour of
yes, of course he is.
It's a total unanimity, which is generally almost invariably a bad sign.
Yeah, and they're like religious zealots. There's no questioning it.
Look, it's very like them, but look what's happening now in the Netherlands and what's happening in Germany, and see it is possible, democratically, peacefully and legitimately, to speak out against this and to change the course of events. And I really do hope that people in this country begin to think seriously about doing that.
Yeah.
Let it go, and what's left of our economy will be destroyed. Our lives will become much colder, darker and less pleasant. And for what? And this is the serious question.
And you see,
what good is all this stuff
this is what I was
doing?
saying, that those who are now fighting back against Just Stop Oil are literally the sort of the people's revolutionary movement, because it's the people who don't want it, and it's the kind of elites and the establishment that do want it. So Just Stop Oil are really part of that. And now it would appear that Keir Starmer had a meeting with Dale Vince, who's the guy that runs Ecotricity, who funds Just Stop Oil, and suddenly Keir Starmer comes out and says, oh, we're going to stop all exploration of North Sea oil and gas.
Yeah, well, again, if Rishi Sunak really wants to get some votes back, then I think if his party started to question this zealotry and intolerance, and to look at what's happened in the Netherlands and Germany, it might again do them some considerable electoral good.
Yes.
I believe very strongly that whatever opposition we have has to be peaceful and democratic. You have to be very careful not to go down the sort of French Gilets jaunes road.
But it won't stay peaceful if these people don't stop doing what they do.
Well, then all the more reason for major mainstream politicians to begin to look seriously at challenging this.
Right, I think so. Because the other problem, I think, for anyone who goes up against it is you now get called, as Sadiq Khan has frequently called Tories in the London Assembly, not interested in saving children's lives.
I know.
And that you don't want to have people breathing clean air. Do you not want to breathe clean air like you're some kind of maniac?
Do you know, I think people are beginning to see through this use of abuse.
Yeah. It's sort of catastrophisation of everything.
It's an attempt to silence people rather than a serious argument. I do hope so. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, because clearly there's no reason why Sadiq Khan can claim that he's trying to make the air better, because what he's doing is just charging you to pollute it. That's the only thing he's doing.
At the end of it, I mean, if we went back to the Stone Age, the air would be a lot cleaner, wouldn't it?
Possibly so. And nobody would go anywhere.
Undoubtedly the case.
Well, that's where we're headed. And one of the reasons...
Maybe the Bronze Age.
Maybe we're headed there because of lockdown, because once again, I'm afraid, you've been proven correct. There's a study out that you've probably been reading this morning in the Telegraph from Johns Hopkins and Lund University, in which it basically said the cost of lockdown was far higher than the benefit.
Well, which of course I think was evident to anybody with any grasp very early on in events.
Yeah.
We were discussing this.
Yes, but you were one of the few people who grasped it earlier than anybody else.
It still astonishes me
that
all the worst predictions were immediately accepted as right, and nobody looked. There were people like John Ioannidis, who very serious people who were looking at it very early on, saying, "You're not totally sure this is right." I mean, if only we had the resources, I don't have them, to look into all kinds of things like what was classified as a COVID death, and also the number of people who died with or of COVID who were had comorbidities, like serious other diseases, and were in the what you might call the higher age groups. I'm in one of those myself. Yeah. Would it suggest that the measures which have meant corralling the entire population, and particularly this extraordinarily crazy closing of schools, which did so much damage to
which apparently, according to this study, prevented something like 3% of deaths.
If that, I mean, did it prevent any? How can one tell? It's whatever it is, it remains the case. We burnt down the house to get rid of a wasp nest, and at the end of it, once the house had burnt down, the wasp nest was still there.
Yes,
because what we now have, of course, is a devastated health service, and huge numbers of people whose lives, particularly the healthy old, whose lives were put on hold for months and who suffered permanently health damage, and of course awful thing, which makes me grind my teeth. The people at university during that period who were cheated completely of what should have been a proper university education and can never get it back.
No.
And there's a number of people who suffer for this, and ultimately we look at it for what? Did we even gain anything? I mean, they come up with the figure. My strong suspicion is that it did no good at all. I mean,
interesting figures in here, particularly about the mental health of one particular group, which is interesting to me because my two sons are in this age category, 16 to 39. Percentage of people with mental health issues before the lockdown, 3.5%. After, 23%.
I know, this is terrible, isn't it?
It's huge, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's a massive increase.
It's the nearest you'll get to an index of the misery personal misery that it caused to so many people.
Right.
How can we see? These things are so hard to put your finger on. Any statistic or figure has to be open to doubt or re-examination, and I'm always very careful with them. But it does seem to me that if you think about this seriously, we did make a very grave mistake.
Yeah, and we know that we have not yet recovered from it. The reason people don't go to work anymore, some people stop working altogether, some people just don't go to an office anymore, and it's nothing to do with whether the office wants them there. People have just decided this is now how I want to live, because basically all bets are off, because now everybody says, well, they could do that. The government could do anything.
Oh, it's a revolution in the way that we live, and not necessarily one for the better. I mean, for some people, it may well be for the better. I'm not saying that nobody's benefited from working from home. Even some employers can't cope with it, but a lot can't. And a lot of people, of course, can't work from home and never will be able to, and a lot of businesses can't function.
No, I think we've created a sort of two-tier society where we've got people who are kind of in what you might call in the old days sort of white-collar jobs, where you can sit at home with a laptop and use a phone and use internet and use emails, and that's all fine. But the guy who's bringing you your stuff from Amazon and the bloke who's delivering your shopping, you know, they're not doing it from home.
Yeah. You know, but all of us are paying the highest taxes for 80 years, and all of us are suffering the worst inflation in our lifetimes, and a rackety cost of living, constant cost of living rise. And that's imposed on everybody, of course, except, as usual, the super rich, who don't need to worry about any of these things. But everybody else has got to face that, and that will last for some long time to come. It's just a huge argument for caution before taking decisions of such moment, and for listening. And we also saw, yet again in the papers over the weekend, more evidence of the government actually using its power to try and shut down debate.
Yes.
The opposite of its function. A free government of a free country has to keep debate open, or what's the point of the country being free at all? Yeah,
this was the big piece in the Telegraph, wasn't it, about Molly Kingsley, and about how there was a sort of unit, which I mentioned Neil O'Brien earlier, who was involved in this kind of unit to monitor journalists and to put journalists on a sort of blacklist.
Not just journalists, but distinguished scientists and doctors, like Carl Hennigan, a man of total integrity, who was apparently the subject of some sort of, I don't know what you call it really, but
it's a bit McCarthy-esque, isn't it?
No, it's worse than that. It's not. I mean, the one justification you come up with for the McCarthy era is there were actually some communists. Right. In this case, you had people who were actually trying very hard to do good and to speak intelligently and rationally about a major national crisis, and contribute as they've been educated to do to the good of the nation. Not merely being prevented from doing so, but being actually punished for doing so.
Yeah. And I mean, do you blame the politicians, or do you blame the kind of advisors like Sage and people like that, and like sort of, Patrick Vallance and others, who were clearly sort of catastrophising every situation and saying, well, because if you're Boris Johnson and you're presented with a paper which says, if you don't do this, hundreds of thousands of people are going to die, he's going to do it.
I think huge numbers of people need to question what they did. Those who didn't speak out against it, those who didn't call for more caution, those who fell into it so quickly, those who decided that the only option to adopt was the Chinese option, those who just junked without thought the existing precautions which were already in place and had been devised after careful thought, and just saying, let's get rid of it, let's copy communist China. How can anyone not have thought that might not be a good idea? Right. There were so many people who didn't, it seems to me, stand up against it. Those are the ones I think if somebody like Neil Ferguson genuinely believed the figures that he was coming out with, then he was.
But he's never got anything right in his life.
He was absolutely obliged to say so.
Yeah.
But there were other people who were equally obliged to say, well, actually, Neil, we're not sure you're right. And they were the ones who were missing.
But you remember Neil Ferguson also said in an interview once that, we didn't think we could impose the kinds of restrictions on people that China did.
Yeah, no, I know.
But then later we worked out actually that we could.
Yes,
which was an extraordinary thing.
Yeah, it was. What happened was it was the stuff coming out of Italy that I think caused the panic, which I would like to see re-examined as well. I would like to see what was actually going on in Italy, as opposed to what seemed to me to be slightly. How can I put it? Melodramatic.
Well, we had a caller earlier who was sort of hinting at that. I'm not sure that that's true. I mean, I know that there was a massive connection between the garment industry in northern Italy and China, which was one of the reasons why the outbreak happened there so quickly, supposedly anyway. But I remember, like you, the sort of the pictures of the lorries driving dead bodies around at night.
You often do have to wonder how such pictures come to be taken. Generally, authorities and everybody else take great care not to display such things. But anyway, who knows? But the other thing, of course, Italy was that it incredibly successfully had very good health services for old people, and had incredibly successfully kept an awful lot of people healthy and alive well into old age. And also in Italy, there's still an awful lot of people who live with their grandparents, and this is a special circumstance different from the norm. But you see, all of these things, once you begin to discuss them in detail, demonstrate a need for detailed, cautious, careful examination of the facts, rather than a rush to judgment. But what we had was a rush to judgment.
Yes, we did. And as far as the deaths are concerned, I mean, if you look at them now, they still would appear to be largely, as you say, people with comorbidities, people who were much older. The numbers who died below sort of the age of 60 are very small.
Yes, and each of these deaths is a tragedy.
Yeah.
But, and for everyone involved and for their families and relatives, but the thing is that people do actually die. There is a death rate, and some deaths are not realistically preventable.
No.
The question is, were we actually seriously preventing deaths?
Well, these were all the figures that disappeared. Do you remember there was 1 year, I think I remember it was 2020 or 2021, where there were no deaths from flu at all.
Yes.
And looking at this report, they were saying that basically over the course of any given flu season in Europe, 72,000 people die. It just happens.
Yeah.
Oh, this 1 year, nobody died of flu.
There are very many peculiar things, and but as I say, the questions about what actually was being recorded as what was also fascinating, and one would hope that when this inquiry eventually gets into second gear, it might begin to look at these things, but I rather doubt it.
And the people who were very sort of vociferously in support, shall we say, of these restrictions, some of whom are still defending them, they've gone pretty quiet, haven't they? There's not many people left out there now who will say, well, we're very happy that we did it, if we hadn't done it, this would have happened. There's not that many of them left.
I wonder, in private they probably still think so. And I don't mind them having wanted to do it or advocated it. If that's what they felt, as I say, that's what they should do. What I minded at the time, and still mind, was the close to defamation of anybody who called for caution.
Yeah,
and that's what made me angry.
I mean, did you ever feel under pressure not to write things?
No, I was extraordinarily fortunate in being completely free from any of that. But what I did feel was a distress, as anybody does, at being abused as a wicked and irresponsible person, when I thought I was simply doing my job of saying, I'm worried about this, I think this is a mistake. That's what I was saying. And instead of people taking on my arguments bit by bit and saying you're wrong about this, you're wrong about that, I was a wicked person.
But I remember the debate we had with you, and I was in the middle, and Dan Hodges was on the other side, and he was very pro lockdown, wasn't he?
He was. He had some interesting doubts about it. But he in the end, when we had the debate, it was quite civilised.
Yes.
Because it
often is more civilised than it is on Twitter.
Well, there weren't many opportunities for civilised debate at the time. You didn't. The major broadcasters were not.
They weren't doing
it. You know, it was left to independents.
Heretics.
Yeah. Well, okay. But isn't it great that we have independents?
Isn't it? Long may it continue.
Oh, yeah, and long may they flourish. The more independence, let 100 flowers bloom, the more independent media there is, the more likely we are to retain some sort of freedom.
Yeah. This morning's still on, so have no fear.
Right.
Peter, good to see you. Thank you very much indeed. Peter Hitchens there.